Hello everyone, and welcome back to the 10 Days of JavaScript. Here we are in day number 8, and in this lesson we are going to talk about scope and context. So what is scope and what is context? Well, here are my own sarcastic definitions. So I would say that scope is the biggest source of confusion regarding variables, and my definition for context would be the biggest source of confusion regarding objects. Now, these tongue-in-cheek definitions are not actually helpful, but right away they do let us know that scope has to do with variables and context has to do with objects. But beyond that, let's dive deeper. So let's start with scope, and then in the second half of this lesson, we can cover context. Now, instead of trying to explain scope with only words, let's work through a few examples together where we can see scope in action. So imagine we have a variable. I'm going to say let my name equal a string of text. And now let's try to access this variable from within a function. So maybe down here, let's create a brand new function. You can name it whatever you want. I'm going to name it maybe amazing function, parentheses, curly brackets. And just as an example, let's try to log out to the console the myname variable, just to see if we have access to it. So console.log myname. Okay, and then let's actually call or execute this function to test it out. So on a new line, we can just call that function, amazing function. Okay, now if we check the console, awesome. Now this is just review. We've already done this before, so the question is, why am I showing this to you? Well, it's because the topic of scope has to do with where we can access a variable from. Let me show you what I mean. So this code is working perfectly, but what if we move this first line of code here? What if we cut and paste it to live within the function? Let's try that out. Let's cut this first line into our clipboard. And then inside the body of our function, maybe right above the console line, paste in your clipboard. Okay, and then let's cut and paste this console.log line. Let's cut that into our clipboard. And let's move it down below this function call. Now at first glance, as a beginning programmer, we would think that this would work. Right? We've got this function that's going to create a variable named myname. Then we are calling the function, so we know that that code is going to get executed. So we would think that we would be able to log out to the console myname. But if I check the console, we just see a big error message that says my name is not defined. So we just smashed our head up against a brick wall, and this is our first example of running into an issue with scope. Now, before we worry about what the word scope means in this sense, let's first answer the question as to why this code is not working. Why are we receiving that error message in the console? Well, it's because within the body of this function, or I should say within this block of code, within these curly brackets, as far as variables are concerned, we are in our own little new world that is separate or private from the outside world. So we would say that this variable is scoped to this block, these curly brackets, meaning it cannot be accessed from outside the block. So down here, when we try to access that variable, as far as this line of code is concerned, this variable doesn't even exist. Now let me put things back to the way they were at the beginning of the lesson and explain why that was working. So let me cut the variable line back up out of the function, up at the very top here, and let me cut and paste the console.log line back into the function. Now this code will work just fine. It works because up on this line, when we are creating the variable, we are not inside a block or any curly brackets, right? We are just out in the open in what we would call the global scope. This works because scope is like a one-way street. The traffic only flows in one direction. Code can reach outwards to access a variable, but it cannot reach inwards. Now, don't worry, I don't expect you to understand what I just said. That's why we're going to work through a new example right now to understand what I mean by inwards and outwards. So right now, make sure your code looks like mine. If you need to pause the video for a second to catch up, that's okay. Inside our function, I want you to cut the console.log line. So just cut it into your clipboard, and in its place, let's write an if statement. So let's say if, parentheses, for the condition, why don't we say if 2 plus 2 double equal sign 4, right? Because we know that will always be true. Right after these parentheses, let's include curly brackets and drop down. And now inside the if statement, let's just paste back in the console.log line. Okay, now if I check the console, we see that things are working just like before the if statement. So you might be wondering why I even added this if statement at all. Well, it's because it's a great example to explain what I mean when I say that scope begins inwards and moves outwards. Right? That analogy when I said that scope is a one-way street. So when this line of code runs, JavaScript's first instinct is to see if there is a myname variable as close to home as possible, meaning within this scope, within this block, within the curly brackets for the if statement. So just as a quick test, within the if statement, right above the console.log line, if I say let myname equal Brad the third, and then check the console, we see Brad the third. However, if we either delete this line or just put 2 forward slashes to comment it out and pretend that it's deleted, if JavaScript sees that there is no myname variable within the current local scope, well, it's then going to look up the scope chain or look one level outside of itself. So outside of this scope, the next closest scope is within the body of our function. So just as a test, if we said let myname equal Brad Jr. and check the console, we see Brad Jr. Okay, and then finally, if we either deleted this line or just got rid of it with 2 forward slashes, JavaScript would say, okay, there's no myname inside the local block. There's no myname in the block that's one level up. Why don't we check another level up from that? And that would finally land us in the global scope, and it would see that, aha, that variable exists. So if we check the console, it's back to just Brad. So the idea is that when a line of code runs and you're looking for a variable, JavaScript is first going to look for that variable as close to home as possible within the current scope. If it's not there, it's just going to keep moving up the scope chain one level at a time until it finds what it's looking for. Now, it's important that we really understand what's going on here. So really quick, this is not a case of these lines overriding or updating this original variable. That is not what's happening. Even though these 3 variables of myname all have the same identifier or label name, they are 3 completely independent and separate variables. Let me show you not only how we can prove that, but also what I mean. Because I remember when I first learned programming, and I saw an example like this, I actually misinterpreted it and saw it backwards. I saw it as, okay, we're creating the variable in the global scope, and then we are updating the variable in this scope, and then we're updating it again in this scope. That is not the case. These are 3 completely separate variables. And I can prove that to you by removing the slashes to uncomment out these 2 lines. So let's get rid of the slash here, and then get rid of the slash here. And now let's do this. Within our innermost block of code, within the if statement, inside the console.log, let's begin by saying inside the if statement, and then a comma, and then output our variable. Okay, now right after the if statement, but still within our function, so right here, let's log out to the console and say inside our function, and then comma, and then our variable. And then finally, down at the very bottom, on the last line of code, after we call the function, So we are in the global scope now. Let's log out to the console and say in the global scope, and then comma, and then output my name. Okay, now if we check the console, we see inside the if statement is one variable with its value. Inside our function is a different variable with its own value. And in the global scope, that's another variable with a different value. What was the point of this experiment? It's to show you that these are three completely separate variables. Even though they have the same identifier or label, it doesn't matter. The let statement creates a variable within the current local scope. It does not matter if that identifier or label name has been used in outer scope. Remember that inside a block of code, inside these curly brackets, it's like our own new private little world as far as variables are concerned. Meaning it's almost like we get a clean slate. We can reuse the same variable names, and JavaScript knows that we do not want to affect any of the variables in outer scope. We just want to create a brand new separate variable that is scoped to this block. Now, you might be scratching your head right now and wondering, well, what if we wanted to mutate the global original variable from within our innermost block? Is there a way we can do that? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Just to save confusion, why don't we get rid of this let my name equal Brad Jr. line. And let's also get rid of the two console.log lines within our function. Okay, now within the if statement, what if we wanted to update or mutate or change the value of the global scoped my name variable? Well, all we would need to do is remove the word let from this line of code. The let statement says create a new variable for this local scope. But if we get rid of let, now we are just trying to work or access the variable, and we're setting it to equal something. So here's what JavaScript's going to do. It's going to see this variable and ask itself, does this variable already exist within this current local scope? It doesn't, so then it's going to look one level up, just within the function. It's going to see that it doesn't exist there either, and then it's going to check one level up, and it's going to say, okay, it does exist in the global scope. That must be what you're talking about right here. So I'm going to let you update or change that variable. This is what I was talking about earlier when I said that scope moves in one direction. It's a one-way street. Inside code can reach outwards for variables, but outside code cannot reach inside for variables. So long story short, we set it to equal Brad the third, and now down here where we are logging out to the console in the global scope, and then our variable, if we check the console, we see Brad the third. Awesome. Now before we switch gears in this lesson and move on to the second half and talk about context instead of scope, there's one more scope related thing we need to cover. So throughout this course, when we've been creating or declaring a variable, we've been using the word let. However, until about 3 or 4 years ago, there was no let in JavaScript. And instead, we had to create variables by saying var and then the label or identifier, and otherwise the syntax is the same, right? So if you're looking at older code or if you inherit a project from someone, you might see var being used instead of let. Now there are several subtle differences between var and let, but right now I want to show you the one big, huge, glaring difference between the two. The biggest difference between var and let is that let uses block scope, whereas var uses function scope. So what in the world does that mean? Let me show you. So within our if statement, at the beginning of this line of code, if we put the word let here, we know that that's going to create a variable that is scoped to this block, right? Scoped to the if statement's curly brackets. So let is going to look for the nearest enclosing block. And a block can be several different things, right? We know that an if statement uses a block, these curly brackets. We know that a while loop uses the curly brackets in a block. Clearly, the body of a function uses a block. Okay, but the idea here is that let is going to make it so that this variable is only accessible from within the nearest enclosing block. So right now, we would not be able to access the variable right here outside of the if statement. However, if we changed this to a var instead of a let, var uses function scope instead of block scope. So var is going to say, you know what? I don't care that the if statement has curly brackets and that it's a block. Since I'm a var, I only care about the curly brackets of a function, right? Because var uses function scope instead of block scope. This means that this var variable is accessible anywhere inside its enclosing function, even outside of the if statement. So we could access my name right here within the function. Now, again, historically, that's how we created variables in JavaScript, but in the last 3 or 4 years, JavaScript finally got access to let. And the reason that 99% of developers use the word let instead of var is because almost all other programming languages besides JavaScript use block scope instead of function scope. Block scope is just what most of us are used to. It's a paradigm that we are familiar with, and it's a super popular opinion that block scope leads to less confusing code, less scope confusion, and just less problems overall. So long story short, that's the difference between let and var, but in the current year and looking forward, I encourage you to always use the word let and never, or I should say basically never, use the word var. All right, and that's scope in a nutshell. If you're still a bit confused regarding scope, that's okay. That's completely normal. In fact, I have worked with professional mid-level developers who were even sometimes still confused by scope. Big picture, you do not need to be a scope guru at this point. I just want the topic to be on your radar. It's something you need to be aware of. And if your code isn't working, you might want to double or triple check your scope and make sure your variables are pointing towards what you think they are pointing towards. Remember, you can always use console.log to check the value. Okay, at this point, let's change gears. We've talked about scope. Now let's talk about context. So I'm actually going to delete all of the code that we have and start fresh.